during the time. Now we have Peter Blair talking about a joint paper with Pat Bayer and Kenneth Whaley on whether school spending is valuable and efficient, a national study of the capitalization of school spending and local taxes. The discussion will be the redoubtable Joe Jerko. Okay, over to you, Peter.
Good morning, Ed. Thank you so much for having us. I hope you can hear me really well. And thank you to all of the conference participants who are joining via Zoom and also via the live stream, especially to my family who's joining from the Bahamas. Welcome. Let me share screen now. Perfect. As Ed mentioned, this work is joint work with Pat Bayer and Kenneth Whaley, who recently graduated from Clemson and is one of my former PhD students. Let me first start off by situating this work within the context of the broader work that my research group does. So we're a group of applied microeconomists who specialize particularly in education and also labor, public and urban. And this work is done jointly with faculty and student collaborators from several universities. And in addition to this current paper, we have selected works that look at occupational licensing, why don't elite colleges expand, the demand for skills, and my job market paper, which was on neighborhood tipping points. There are three main questions that we focus on in this paper. So the first is, does school spending matter? The second is school spending efficient overall? And the third is, does it matter how school funding is allocated? Namely, does it matter how much money is allocated to salary spending versus non-salary spending? So first, let's orient you in this literature in terms of thinking about how these questions are typically tackled in the literature. So one of the key, very credible designs in this literature are the boundary discontinuity designs, which was pioneered by Sandy Black in her 1999 QJE paper. My co-author Pat Bayer also has a very important paper with Fernando and Rob looking at these boundary discontinuity designs as well. And the key idea with these boundary discontinuity designs is that what you want to do is compare identical houses on opposite sides of school attendance zones. And so what you do in this comparison is you're really holding fixed school spending, taxes, house and neighborhood quality, and any differences in the house prices are really capitalizing differences in school quality across the attendance zone as measured by test scores. And so these are highly credible estimates with really strong internal validity. There are also related designs, for example, like the close election designs from the Salini et al. Paper. Now, whereas these designs are like incredibly valuable in terms of advancing our knowledge, there are some limitations with the boundary discontinuity design. So the first is that this focus on test scores might actually underestimate the total return to education, especially if we believe that spending on schools matters for not just test scores, but a lot of other outcomes too. In addition to this, because across these boundaries you're holding fixed both spending and taxes, it's really difficult to answer this question of whether or not school spending is efficient, even though we can answer the question of whether school spending is valued by households. The third limitation is that these designs have a really high data requirements. You need microdata that captures a specific geography at a specific point in time. And so from that standpoint, while they're very internally valid, it raises questions of external validity. So what is it that we're going to do in this paper? So the key insight of this paper is that we could use a research design developed by Jackson, Johnson, and Persico in their 2016 QJE paper to address this long-standing question of like whether school funding is both efficient as well as valued by households too. And so the approach is the following. We're going to use these school finance reforms to isolate exogenous variation in school spending and local tax revenue. And so in the original paper, they do it for school spending. We're going to show that these instruments are also helpful in terms of identifying exogenous variation in tax revenue. And then secondly, we're going to test for house price capitalization of both spending and taxes using a national panel of local house price indices that's going to span 25 years, and that's going to cover 42 states. What we're going to do thirdly is we're going to take these spending elasticities and these tax elasticities, and we're going to combine them to come up with an efficiency test that's going to be inspired by this very classic paper by Oates in 1969. Let me give you a preview of our key findings. So the first headline finding is that school funding matters. This is a really important result because there's been a lot of debate in the education literature about whether or not increasing school inputs is valued by households. In particular, we're going to find that a 1% increase in school expenditure is going to increase house prices by between 0.8% and 1%. Secondly, when we implement our efficiency test, which is inspired by the Oates 1969 paper, what we're going to find is that a 1% increase in local taxes used to fund schools is going to increase house prices by 0.08%. Moreover, we're going to fail to reject the null hypothesis that spending overall is going to be efficient because 0 is going to lie in the confidence interval of these efficiency elasticity estimates that we're going to get from the paper. While overall, it seems like we fail to reject the null that school spending is efficient, what we're going to find is that salary spending in particular is highly capitalized into house prices, and moreover, salary spending is going to be inefficiently low. Now, this could operate through two channels. It either could be operating through this quality channel in which paying individual teachers more is valued by households, or it could operate through this quantity channel through which when you spend more money on salaries, you're able to add more teachers at the same wages but reduce class size. What are some of the main contributions of this paper? So we're going to provide some of the first national estimates of school spending and tax capitalization using this market-based test for whether or not schools matter. And this is going to help us to answer this really old, 50-year-old question of public finance, which has been very tough to empirically pin down as to whether or not local public goods are efficiently provided. On the methodological side, what we're going to do is we're going to increase the external validity of the existing estimates precisely because we're going to have national variation. Moreover, the data requirements are going to be substantially lower precisely because we're going to be using publicly available aggregate data. And then the third contribution is going to be that this research design is going to be feasible even in low density areas where other designs might be infeasible, precisely because of their high data requirements. Let me jump into the data. So to construct our panel of school districts that consist of both house prices, school finance and demographic variables, and the first year of these court-mandated school finance reforms, we're going to have 3 different sources. Our house price data is going to come from the FHFA, and we're going to construct a 25-year-old panel that's going to cover 42 states, including the District of Columbia. Our education data is going to come from the National Center for Education Statistics and the Common Core of Data. And from this, we're going to have a panel of spending, taxes, and school demographics. And in total, we're going to have upwards of 6,000 school districts. We're going to follow the literature in terms of taking the coding of the first year of these court-mandated school finance reforms from the Jackson, Johnson, and Percival paper, which we're hereafter going to refer to as JJP. The first set of these school finance reforms happened in California in 1971, and over time they rolled out across over 29 states in the United States, with the most recent one happening in Oregon in 2009. A little background on these school finance reforms. The implementation of the court-ordered reforms by the state legislatures took several different morphologies. So you had foundation grants, for example, which guaranteed a certain amount of per pupil funding. You had district power equalization, which guaranteed a particular tax base even to low income districts. The key idea here is that these reforms are always going to introduce some kind of redistributive component where you're going to have money being redistributed from high spending districts to low spending districts. And so what we're going to do to construct our instruments for school spending and taxes is we're going to sort the school districts into quartiles based on their pre-reform school spending in the state distribution, and then we're going to interact those quartiles with time since reform to generate the instruments for both taxes and school spending. Now you may be wondering, how can we get instruments for 2 endogenous regressors? Well, formally we're going to be over-identified because each of these quartile interacted with time since reform dummies is going to be an instrument. And so we're going to have 2 endogenous regressors and 4 times t instruments. For our empirical strategy, what we're going to do is we're going to be regressing the log of the house price indices in district D at time t on the log of per pupil expenditures. And so this parameter theta here in equation 1 is going to be the elasticity of the house price index with respect to school spending. And this is going to be capturing how much households value spending on schools. In our second specification, we're going to introduce a rule for per pupil expenditures on taxes. And in both contexts, we're going to use these quartile interacted with time since reform dummies as instruments for taxes and spending. Okay. So I'm going to show you a set of event study diagrams. So just to orient yourself, on the horizontal axis is going to be the time since reform. So negative times are going to correspond to years prior to the reform. 0 is going to correspond to the year of the court-mandated reform. And then positive years are going to correspond to time since the reform. And on the vertical axis is going to be our outcome of interest, in this case, changes in log spending. We've organized these figures in terms of the different quartiles of pre-reform spending. So the blue is going to be Q1, the red is going to be Q2, the third is going to be Q3, and all of these are going to be normalized relative to spending in Q4, which are the highest spending districts. The headline from this figure is the following. Prior to the reform, we see that the different school districts look pretty similar. once we control for pre-trends, et cetera. But after the reform, we see that there's an increase in spending in the Q1, the Q2, and to a lesser extent, the Q3 districts relative to the Q4 districts. We see a similar thing for house prices too. Prior to the reform, they look pretty similar. After the reform, there's a fanning out where we see an increase in house prices in the Q1 districts relative to the Q4 districts. And it's important to mention that that comparison is relative. Now, when we put this all together in terms of our estimation framework, what we're going to find is that there's an elasticity of house prices with respect to school spending of between 0.8 and 1. And this is going to be robust to like including just district fixed effects or including everything, for example, like census controls, the policy controls, and measures of the quality of our data coverage. Right? Now, when we compare this with the existing estimates in literature, in the JJP paper, what they show is that a 1% increase in school spending is going to increase future wages of kids by between 0.7 to 0.8%. And so our elasticity estimates of 0.8 to 1 are going to be very similar and comparable in magnitude to what we see in the JJP paper. Moreover, the way to interpret these results is to really think about the range of the data. So we see increases in per pupil expenditures of between like about 5% to 10%. And so what you should think about is that for an exogenous increase of about 5% in school spending, that's going to increase house prices by 4 to 5%. We're not going to be able to say something about what happens if you were to double spending on schools, for example. Okay. Now, here's the similar event study figure for local property taxes. And what you can see here again is that relative to the highest spending quartiles prior to the reforms, these districts all look very similar once we control for pre-trends. After the reforms, we see an increase in tax revenue from the Q1 districts, the Q2 districts, and the Q3 districts relative to Q4. And a lot of this is going to be driven by the Q4 districts underinvesting in taxes precisely because of the redistributive nature of the school finance reforms. And this is something that Carolyn has shown very convincingly in a lot of her work. Now, when we put these two elasticities together, the headline is going to be the following. Even though we've included a rule for per pupil tax expenditures, notice that the elasticities of spending the elasticities of house prices with respect to spending look pretty similar, ranging between 0.8 to 1. And so what this is suggesting to us is that these instruments are decently powerful to isolate exogenous variation in both spending and taxes, and in some sense, like variation that almost seems orthogonal. We can now pull these two together in terms of computing our efficiency estimate, which is going to be inspired by the Oates test. And so the efficiency idea is going to be the following. For a marginal increase in tax revenue that's used exclusively to fund schools, what's the percentage change in house prices? If school funding is going to be efficient on the margin, then there should be no change in house prices. If we see a positive increase in house prices, then what that's going to suggest is that schools funding is inefficiently low. If it's negative, it's going to be the opposite. It's important to flag that our notion of efficiency is a private notion of efficiency because we do not include explicitly a rule for spillovers to surrounding districts. In our particular context, a 1% increase in tax revenue translates into a 0.3% increase in school spending at the mean. And when we put these numbers together, we get an overall efficiency elasticity of 0.08. So this is going to be positive. However, when we look at the confidence interval, what we find is that 0 is in the confidence interval. So we fail to reject the null that overall school spending is going to be efficient. We can do this separately for rural and non-rural schools. And the headline here is that school spending is going to be less capitalized in rural schools than non-rural schools. But at the same time, too, we're going to fail to reject the null that school spending is efficient. Now, there's an important point about, does it matter what types of expenditures you're spending the money on? What we do here in this event study plot is we break it out by salary versus non-salary expenditures. And so this is just the event study figure for the salary expenditures. And we see something very similar, where prior to the reforms, these quartiles look very similar. After the reforms, we see an uptick in salary expenditures in the lower spending districts prior to the reform. Now, when we combine these two things together, we can regress the log of the house price index on the salary and the non-salary expenditures, again, using our pre-reform quartiles interacted with the time dummies as our instruments. And the headline finding is the following. Whether we include both salary and non-salary spending as in column 1, or if we run them separately as in column 3 and 4, we find that the elasticities are going to be pretty similar in terms of like the effect of more salary spending on the house price index. And in fact, the salary spending is going to be highly capitalized into house prices. When we implement our efficiency test for the salary spending, what we're going to find is that we do reject the null that salary spending is efficient. In fact, a 1% increase in salary spending is going to increase house prices by 1%, and 0 is clearly not in this confidence interval. There are a couple of mechanisms that we can look through in terms of trying to interpret our results. So the first is you might be concerned that there is sorting, and indeed we do find a rule for sorting. So as you spend more on schools, richer households move in and they price out poorer households. We're able to decompose the effect of the capitalization effect of school spending on house prices into a component that comes from the direct effect of spending and then the indirect effect that's due to sorting. And what we find with this breakdown is about 70% of the capitalization elasticities that we estimate are coming from the direct effect of spending on house prices, and about 30% is coming from the effect of sorting. The second thing is that you might be worried that the weights that we're using to estimate both the tax elasticities and the spending elasticities are different, and so therefore maybe our efficiency estimates are going to be sensitive to the type of variation that we have here. So what we do is we collapse the variation either into each quartile individually as in column 1, or we do a comparison of Q1 versus the other quartiles, or Q1 and Q2 versus Q3 and Q4, or we can do Q1 and Q3 versus Q4, and then we can do the same analysis. And what we find here is that these weights are all remarkably pretty similar, and the efficiency results seem pretty similar as well too. And so our results are going to be robust to thinking about, are going to be robust to the type of variation that we use in this context. The third thing that you might worry about is that house prices are going to be forward-looking. It's going to depend on the future spending on schools and the future taxes as well. And so what we can do is we can regress our house prices on leads for school spending and leads for taxes as well. And if anything, our initial results in this paper are conservative relative to taking into account the forward-looking nature of house prices. Okay. So in conclusion, our work is going to speak to two long-standing debates in economics. So one, are locally public goods provided efficiently? And this goes back to really old literature starting in the 1930s with Musgrave, all the way through Tibu and then through Oates. The second is, does school spending matter? Dating back to the Coleman report, work by Eric Hanushek, and more recent work by Johnson, Jackson, Persico, and a host of other co-authors. And what we're going to do methodologically is we're going to propose a way to jointly estimate the elasticity of house prices with respect to school expenditures and taxes that, 1, builds on the existing literature, 2, reduces the data requirements, and 3, increases the external validity. And what we find is resoundingly school spending does matter. House prices increase when school expenditures increase exogenously. And this is a revealed preference evidence that school funding matters, because this is households saying that they are willing to pay for this. Moreover, this is going to corroborate the evidence from the Jackson, Johnson, and Persico paper, where they show positive labor market outcomes for kids who are in schools that experience exogenous increases in school spending. So in a sense, it's as if parents are accurately forecasting that when school funding increases, there's a better future for their kids, and they're willing to invest in that on the front end by paying more for houses. The second thing that we're going to find too is that house prices are going to be especially responsive to increases in spending on teacher salaries. And so it does indeed matter how the money is spent to. And so in a sense, school spending matters, and how it's spent matters very, very importantly as well. In terms of our headline efficiency results, we're going to fail to reject the null hypothesis that overall spending is efficient. However, we are going to find that spending on salary inputs are going to be inefficiently low. Thank you very much for your time. I will turn it over now to Joe Durko, who is the discussant.
Great, thank you, Peter. Terrific. Over to you, Joe. Thanks.
Unmuted. Hopefully, I've got a video, and let me share. Trying to find this. There we go. Ed, tell me if you can see that. Not yet?
Not yet. Well,
okay, hang on.
I'm seeing you surrounded by beautiful Philadelphia.
There you go. That's
with the Wharton logo.
It's West Philly. So share screen. I don't want to. How do I do this, files? I see. It must be. How do I get my screen up?
So do you not have the share screen capacity? Do you
I
have
do.
the share screen?
I do it all the time. I don't know why I can't get my PowerPoint. Well, it's all words, so it's
Is your PowerPoint open on your desktop?
Yep. Certainly is. Computer optimized screen. I don't want that. You don't want to see my screensaver. You can see my email, but that won't help. Okay.
You want to send me the file and I can share it?
Sure.
Let me do that.
Sure, and then I'll start because it's
Yeah,
Word.
go ahead. Just send it to me and then.
Yep. Give me a second. Do you see my email now? I mean, it seems like you do. Screen one.
We don't see any shared screen from you.
No.
Hey Joe, in Zoom
Yeah.
versus Blue Jeans, you have to you select the screen and then you hit bottom right of that window, it starts sharing.
Say it to me again.
You actually have to hit a second button. You select the screen you're going to share and then you hit some bottom right button
How
that
do I
says
select the screen?
start sharing.
How do I select the screen?
You hit share screen,
Well,
it's the green button.
I should have mentioned, by the way, this is all being live streamed on YouTube.
I know.
Which makes this
So
particularly.
everyone on the call knows I'm incompetent this way. So I just hit share screen. What do I do next, Jesse?
Okay, then something should come up that shows you which screen to share that you'll select.
Well,
Or which app?
It's everything but the one I want to share.
No, it might look like it's the Zoom one.
What you can do, Joe, is just once you click share screen, there should be a blue button that says share. Then you click on share, and then you should be able to navigate across your desktop. You got it.
I
There
just
you go.
lost
Now,
it.
now just
So put it
now
on top
just
of your
open up
email.
just open up your PowerPoint.
Just
and
get
then-
out of my email and open my PowerPoint now, Peter. Can you see it now?
Perfect.
Yeah.
That's awesome, Joe.
Woo! Okay, that's good. I can even try to get full screen for you if you want, but
Yeah, that'd be terrific. Thanks, Joe.
let's just go. Okay.
Put it on full screen, Joe. Let's have the production values. Put it on full screen.
You betcha. Okay.
PowerPoint and.
Does that work for you guys?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, good. Ed, thanks for having me do this. Really interesting paper. This is the roadmap. Just the paper. This is a really ambitious paper on a very important topic for two reasons. One is, as Peter said, it's more than a half century now. It's nearly 75 years since the Samuelson-Kibu debate was started, and we're not quite sure in different contexts who was right? And it's because you can imagine both of them being right in different contexts, that voting with your feet matters and will internalize things and will get an efficient outcome in some settings, but not in others. The other thing is this is clearly important in contemporary America because it's obviously linked to the inequality debate. It's empirical in nature. I must say, Ed, about a month or two ago, asked me if I would comment on it, and I said yes, and he sent me some early version of the paper, and I didn't look at it. And then this past weekend, when I started to look at it, I'm going, I know Peter's awfully teched up, and we know Pat's structural, and I'm going, oh my God, he's asked me to referee a deep structural model paper, and no, it's empirical in nature. So, maybe I'll have some useful comments. I am not, given the time limit, I'm not going to provide an overview of the paper itself. For those who haven't read it, the key identification assumption, if it wasn't clear from Peter's comments, is basically the timing of the court order. You have to believe the timing of the court orders are random after controlling for pre-trends and other stuff they control for. There's no perfect instrument here, but this has a fighting chance, and you can quibble with all these things dating back to Oates, but this is an interesting path. I like it, and I'm going to spend the rest of my time really talking about recommendations and asking various questions. So first thing, Peter, is on the data, the house prices. So number one here, I go, you're building up in some way that I want better explained from tract level repeat sales. So how do you aggregate exactly? There is it some type of averages, averaging, and the like. And why I'm interested in that in particular is you're going to care about standard errors in this paper. And I saw an early version where you've cleaned up the data now. You use 1990 to 2015, and the standard errors are a third lower now with a consistent panel and the like. So this matters, and I think what in the back of my mind I'm going at tract level data, that's pretty volatile. Maybe that's jacking up the standard errors, and is there a way to get around that? So I want to know a lot more about just what the volatility is and the like. Other question and recommendation on data is it's since you're using Freddie Mac data, it's conforming loan data. And I want to know when you guys look at your rich districts, your Q4 districts, how many of those folks in rich districts take out conforming loans versus not? Is that conforming loan price data the say of the constant quality index that Freddie Mac's creating for us? How much of that is really representative? And since you're using 1990 on here, certainly you can go to something like CoreLogic, get the universe of sales, and compare that for the rich districts to, okay, what's the price series look like? What's the volatility look like? And again, I'm worried about, I'm not much worried about direction of price changes, but volatility. You could see very few sales in rich districts with conforming loans, at least some of the rich districts. So I would encourage you to do that. And at least from 2000 on in most of these states, you could do it. It's a useful check. Now, my next bullet on questions is this is me. I wanted more information on the school finance reforms, and that's because I don't research this area. So we have many people on this call. Carolyn Oxby was commenting earlier, so you and she are deep in the weeds on this. Maybe it's not needed, but I kind of wanted your slide 12 on the deck you just showed. There's like a 3-year lag between court-ordered reform and meaningful changes in spending on education. For me, what explains that, and does it vary across districts? So I think an interesting figure would be the point estimates and the standard error bounds from your first stage event timeline. Just how much variability is it? A couple of examples of cases that reacted earlier versus later, and just help me understand that type of stuff. I also just want, again, this is me, I don't know these reforms well. The utility of these this goes back to the identification assumption. The great utility of these court-ordered reforms is they generate variation in spending at the district level that is not obviously tightly linked to local taxation. That's the beauty of this stuff. But some of the incentives, as you noted in your talk, they give particularly poorer districts incentives to impose more property taxation, maybe due to state matches and the like. How does that vary across district and the like? So I just wanted more summary statistics. I also think it's important when you in the next version of the paper, just to be clear on what states are and are not being used in estimating pre-trends. So as I understand it, California districts are in the house price elasticity estimation, but they are not in the pre-trend estimation. So let's be clear on where we're getting those results. And that's just because of when the data start. I think that's right, but you can correct me later. Other sort of just question on the data is I am interested in more on the what you guys think is the absolute and relative measurement error by your key right-hand side variables, so your tax and spending variable. Do you believe one's better measured than the other? And I ask because I have friends in California who get charged $2,000 to join the PTA, and that doesn't come under, the equalization order, because that's a private organization. It's not technically the schools, but they sure do use it to provide better educational services for their children. So just help me understand where you think measurement error is greater or less. Okay. The real recommendation I have for you is regarding heterogeneity. That's a really interesting and provocative result that, and it's both interesting and provocative on the combined effect is roughly 0. Okay, in other words, you get what you pay for on average across all these districts and states. That's interesting. I suspect it could be masking a lot of variation in heterogeneity. And I want you to investigate that. And the fact that you find the third small bullet point up there, the fact that you guys find heterogeneity in how what the spending's on, that if you do it on teachers, it's fine. If you do it on staff and other stuff, I presume that's the non-salary spending, not so much. I'm interested in, okay, what happens across different types of districts. Very related is I want a bunch of traditional influence diagnostics. What's driving that result? Is it early states like California? Is it late ones? Is it, now I know as you cut the data, so the way I think about this heterogeneity, what I'm more interested in is the rural, non-rural type of cuts of the data that you did. That was your slide 19. But I want more minority versus white, type of reform, maybe type of district. In other words, I could tell you a story, which I have no idea is true, that if I have a bunch of diversity in demographics, this goes back to work Ed and Alicina did, which is maybe I can't get the right amount of spending or the like because I just got too much diversity and we don't trust each other in my district, and maybe we do it right if we're all of one type. And like, I don't know. You got to be careful there because, right, if you cut it 50, you've got 6,100 districts. You could cut it in different ways. And if you cut it in 52 different ways, a few of them randomly are going to show up as significant. So you got to be disciplined about this. But I really do think that's potentially really important, particularly as you guys think about the inequality part of this paper. And fitting into what's going on in America. So I guess that's my most important recommendation, which is think about whether it's masking heterogeneity. Rural, non-rural is not what interests me the most, what interests you guys, and go from there. And I think you've got the data to do it. Now, one of the things you didn't do, but I saw an earlier version of the paper, and it won't surprise anyone on the webinar today that I'm interested in the supply side. So in the version of the paper I read, they had an interesting result in the price elasticity estimation that used Albert Say's geographic measure of supply elasticity and found that capitalization was about 20 to 25% lower in highly elastic areas. And that makes sense to me, right? If I see if I could see a rapid supply response, I wouldn't expect as much capitalization. And that could be a really important bias. Again, in the slide deck, you didn't mention it, but I think you could do a lot of interesting work there and perhaps clean up a lot. And obviously what I'm worried about is this could affect your overall conclusion that, you get what you pay for. In this, and voting with your feet appears to matter. And I think you could do a really lot more at the school district level using supply and permit data. Just I guess you had to be on the real estate day on Wednesday, but Ben Keyes and Caitlin Warback had a paper using finer spatial variation, supply elasticity. Yesterday, Nate Down-Snow and Lou Hahn had a paper using microgeography. I think you can reach out to that literature and really control for that. And again, you've got enough data that I think you could do something. I want to also make a point on the forward-looking nature of house prices. In the slide, so Peter was kind enough to send me a slide deck earlier, and it had 42 slides, not 30. And one of the 42 slides one of the slides he didn't show today, but he did reference, is the forward-looking nature of house prices. And as you know, it's possible, since you're using house prices, not rents, it's possible today's price reflects expectations about tomorrow's school spending and taxation. And in the results that I saw from a bigger slide deck, they can't reject, the more they assume you can predict out year spending and taxation, you're going to find a significantly above zero combined effect. Okay, that they're going to find it's inefficiently low spending on education. That's another reason I want heterogeneity. I see you can come up with a plausible specification that finds a non-zero result. It's not massively big, but it's non-zero. And given the heterogeneity in the effects of spending, like I said, that's my main recommendation, is think more about heterogeneity in general, but don't go crazy, because again, we all know if you do it 52 ways, some of them are going to be significant. This is just a pure presentation issue. Again, in the version I read, there was a lot of results where you're measuring everything relative to the Q4, the rich districts. That's fine. I found that results interesting. But when you talk about them, tell us about the absolute levels. In other words, are we leveling up? Are we leveling down? That affects. There are results he didn't show on poverty and all types of really interesting stuff. I need to know about levels there, because that's what we care about. Really, last minor point is, should I be worried in the, again, for those of you following along at home, on the far right side of his results pages, he had a control for other social programs, okay? And there were 4 or 5 of them. I was wondering, should I be worried, should you be worried about different states implementing those programs differently? Because you're worried that I get this court ruling at the same time. In other words, there's a common driver generating Serrano versus Priest and, various social interventions by the state or federal government. So if different states do them differently and implement them differently, could that be affecting it? In sum, really interesting paper, really big time question, and I really like it. We can always critique an instrument. I think this is well worth doing. My main issue is explore heterogeneity more. I think you guys can run with that in a lot of interesting ways. So with that, Ed, I'll stop sharing and turn it back to you.
Thank you, Joe. That was great.
I didn't screw up. I could unshare.
No, you did. And this paper, in some sense, is an updating, is a modern version of the Jerko and Tracy papers, which try to look at what government does. And it was perfectly appropriate to have you do this. So Peter, let me want to make a couple of comments. This is a wildly ambitious paper, and it's great that way. It's really wonderful. I do think that this issue of connecting more to Jerko and Tracy and connecting more to the supply side is really important, right? Because in fact, in a perfectly elastic place, you're not going to get capitalization in prices. You're going to get capitalization or something like capitalization in quantities, right? And in constrained places, you're going to get capitalization in prices. You need to take that seriously in the lightest structural version of this that you possibly can take. The second thing that I want to stress is Joe's emphasis on heterogeneity is exactly right. I'm not sure I would have you go on a fishing expedition, but rather think about one way of framing this paper, maybe it's a follow-up paper, is what is it that makes some governments more efficient in their spending than others, right? What is it that, there are hypotheses out there in the literature, what makes some governments effective and other governments not effective? And, obviously there's stuff about ethnic heterogeneity being relevant, but, the role of unions, the role of just jurisdiction size, all of those are potentially, the role of competition, all of those are potentially hugely relevant on this. Fourth, just to end with this, Joe decided not to go there. I'm not going to go there either, but you're going to have to get through Carolyn on the exogeneity of these instruments. And there wasn't enough there in the presentation on this. I was glad not to have it up there at this point because we got into sort of the big conceptual issues, but I don't think you've made that case yet. Okay, over to Andra Gent on the discount factor.
Thanks. Yeah, really interesting. I guess and this came up a little bit in Joe's discussion and in terms of the supply response. Like, I guess what I really wanted to see was, maybe I just missed it, and it's in the paper, but walk me through what would be the fully efficient, how do you get to what the price impact would be in a fully efficient, full information world? Because I think there's some embedded assumptions here about transitory versus permanent changes in spending and about what discount rate you think should capitalize it. I think maybe you're thinking supply is fixed, but if you could just, I don't know if you have time now, but in a future presentation, walk me through what that fully efficient benchmark is.
Hugh McCartney.
Yeah, I just wanted to get a sense for kind of asking about efficiency when we're thinking about kind of the house prices versus test scores and labor market outcomes. And kind of Pat's already kind of addressed some of that. And I'm just kind of thinking about the breakdown in terms of where you're spending on teachers, on class size reduction, and whether, households are getting it, whether parents are getting it wrong compared to the actual production technology, whether there's kind of a wedge between the production technology that they perceive and the actual one. Thanks.
Kyle.
Yes, thanks. It's similar to Hugh's. I'm just trying to think about what makes this a fiscal surplus, right? Like, only a fiscal surplus should be capitalized, and I conjecture maybe it's in the production function. Some other theories have been thrown out, but I'm just wondering how you think about your results. What makes that dollar more valuable so that it is capitalized into housing prices?
Itzy.
I was interested in this result on teacher salaries because I went to fancy prep school, and one of the things we know about elite New England boarding school is while they spend quite a lot on per pupil expenditures, they spend notoriously little on teacher salaries. So this seemed really incongruous to me.
Great. Okay, Peter, you have 90 seconds to respond.
Well, I just want to say a huge thank you. I've taken copious notes. We're also going to copy all of the questions, and then probably maybe the most efficient thing would be to follow up with each person like individually based on the questions. Joe, I want to thank you so much for a really terrific discussion. Like check to everything that you said. Ed, thank you so much for the suggestions in terms of how we think about framing it. You're absolutely right. It is an incredibly ambitious paper because we're trying to do a national capitalization study. In some sense, like using the publicly available data is kind of the point, because we really want to say that, as we think really creatively about the instrument, we could get to increased external validity and hopefully create some insights for policymakers. Like a big question that we have to wrestle with is like how to segment the paper, because we do have a lot of like sorting results. And in some sense, like this paper was actually going to be the first paper that we were going to write in an agenda where we first look at what's happening in terms of like the price responses and the efficiency responses, and then use those as like instruments to like estimate like a sorting model. There's a follow-up paper that really takes this issue of like racial sorting like very seriously. And the headline with that paper is really like, whereas these school finance reforms were really efficient at targeting poor districts, they kind of reverse targeted like minority districts. And so it kind of pushes back against this notion that we could have like race neutral policy to like address racial inequality. And so like we have like a huge like series of papers. We're super excited that you guys are interested in the work that we're doing. And we hope that you'd read the other papers too, especially with the suggestions on like how to think about the fully efficient benchmark. Andra, we would love to get your comments on that. And I'm probably like out of time, but just want to say like a huge thank you to all of you. And then a special thank you to my co-authors, Pat and Kenny. And Kenny's going to be in the job market probably in another year.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Kenny. We all look forward to Kenny. Great job, Peter. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay, over to you, Bruce Meyer, who's going to tell us about measuring the perpetually unmeasurable homelessness. So we're going to be learning about homelessness using linked survey and administrative data. And the discussant is someone who I've been learning